Get ready to have your faith shaken. What you learned about Adam and Eve is a lie. A biblical discovery has just proven Adam was not the first human. Today, you will see the truth that challenges everything you believe about Genesis and the origin of humanity. Ever since you were old enough to understand, the story has been told like this: a lush garden, fruit-bearing trees, a treacherous serpent, and at the center of it all, Adam and Eve, the parents of all humanity. Genesis 2 paints a vivid picture. God, in his wisdom, forms man from the dust of the earth and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, making him a living soul. That is Adam. Shortly after, from Adam's rib, Eve emerges, his companion. They are the firstborn, the archetypes, the original couple from whom we all supposedly descend. This narrative is not just a beautiful story for children, it is the cornerstone of Christian theology. The idea that Adam was the first man is absolutely central. Why? Because it is through him that original sin arises. His disobedience in Eden, the forbidden bite of the fruit of knowledge, is what, according to doctrine, introduced imperfection, death, and separation from God into the world. If Adam were not the first, if he were not the universal progenitor, the entire chain of events leading to the need for a Redeemer, the coming of Jesus Christ to atone for that original sin, would be, at the very least, drastically compromised, if not entirely dismantled. The lineage of humanity, God's covenant with mankind, the very foundation of salvation, all of it rests on the premise of Adam as the first and only created man. But even within this seemingly solid narrative, cracks began to appear early on. If Adam and Eve were the only inhabitants of earth, and their children were Cain, Abel, and Seth, who then was Cain's wife? The Bible tells us that Cain, after killing Abel, was expelled from Eden and dwelt in the land of Nod. There he knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Where did this woman come from? The standard answer is that she was one of his sisters, daughters of Adam and Eve, who are not explicitly mentioned in Genesis, but would have been born later. But this explanation, as convenient as it may be, has always left a nagging question for the more curious. And what about the other lands, mentioned after the departure from Eden? Genesis 4:14-16 describes Cain fearing that whoever finds me will kill me. If there was only his immediate family, why this fear? Whom did he fear? The Bible also speaks of people or peoples that already existed in some passages, even before the proliferation of Adam's descendants. These are the ancient punctuations, the silent questions that the classic narrative seems to ignore. For a long time, they were considered mere inconsistencies, insignificant details. But what happens if they are, in fact, clues to a much greater truth? For centuries, the Church held a monopoly on the narrative of creation. But knowledge, like water, always finds a way to leak. And the forbidden discoveries, those conveniently forgotten or actively suppressed, began to paint a very different picture. Let's start with the Apocryphal texts. These are books that, for one reason or another, were not included in the official biblical canon. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees are powerful examples. In the Book of Enoch, we are introduced to an incredibly rich pre-flood mythology that details the fall of the Watchers, celestial beings who married the daughters of men and produced the Nephilim, giants who inhabited the earth. Who were these daughters of men if Adam and Eve had just begun to populate the world? The language in these texts suggests a humanity that already existed, perhaps in different forms and varieties, even before the Eden narrative as we know it. They speak of a complexity of interactions and lineages that simply does not fit the linear simplicity of the story of Adam and Eve as the sole inhabitants. The Jubilees, in turn, complements this view, detailing genealogies and events that again seem to drastically expand the pre-Adamic population universe. These texts were labeled heretical, banned, and their knowledge restricted. But why the fear of revealing them? And what about the mysterious archaeological records? Modern archaeology, with its excavations and datings, has unearthed a series of anomalies that challenge the classic biblical chronology. Think of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Discovered in the late last century, this is a monumental complex of pillars carved with animals and symbols, predating the Egyptian pyramids by thousands of years. Its dating, around 9600 BCE, places it well before what the traditional biblical chronology suggests for the existence of complex post-flood civilizations. How could a hunter-gatherer society, as was believed, build something so sophisticated? The existence of Göbekli Tepe raises the question, were there advanced civilizations before Adam? Civilizations that official history simply erased? It doesn't stop there. There are reports of gigantic and inexplicable underwater structures in various parts of the world, such as Yonaguni in Japan, which some date to over 10,000 years ago. And the enigmatic findings of giants, skeletons of enormous proportions, unearthed on different continents, but whose records often mysteriously disappear or are discredited. If the Bible speaks of giants, Nephilim, and of peoples before Adam's genealogy, why are these physical pieces of evidence so quickly dismissed or classified as frauds? The truth is, they don't fit the controlled narrative. They are like pieces of a puzzle that were stored in another box, out of reach of public view. And speaking of controlled narratives, let's talk about the ancient heretical interpretations. In the early centuries of Christianity, when doctrine was still being formalized, there was no absolute consensus on Adam's uniqueness. Some Gnostic sects, for example, held far more complex views of creation, suggesting that Adam and Eve were symbolic figures, or represented only a part of a much broader and older humanity. They believed in different levels of reality and different types of beings, many of which preceded the Eden story. These ideas, deemed dangerous for threatening the simplicity and control of the doctrine, were systematically eradicated. Those who defended them were persecuted and their writings destroyed. The official story was sealed, and the door to other possibilities locked. Now, brace yourself for what will truly turn your head. For decades, serious scholars and even some courageous theologians have whispered about a possibility that until now seemed sacrilegious. They weren't looking in apocryphal texts or mysterious ruins, but in the Bible itself, with open eyes and minds. The biblical discovery that proves Adam was not the first is not a new manuscript unearthed from a secret cave or a fragment of a forgotten text. It is a careful rereading, a profound interpretation of a verse that has always been there, hidden in plain sight, in the original Hebrew of Genesis. In Genesis 1:26, God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." In the next verse, Genesis 1:27, we read, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." Now, hold on. The Hebrew word for man here is Adam, with a lowercase a, referring to humanity in general. It is not the proper name Adam. The distinction is subtle but colossal. God created man, humanity, male and female, even before Genesis 2, where the proper name Adam appears for the first time as a specific individual figure formed from the dust. This is not a mere matter of semantics. It is a revelation that shakes the foundation of millennia of teaching. Genesis 1 describes the creation of a generic humanity, a pre-existing population created in the image of God. Only in Genesis 2 does God plant a garden in Eden and place there the man he had formed. This, yes, is the Adam we know, a specific figure with a defined lineage and purpose. So the revelation is this: Adam and Eve were the first of a specific lineage. the lineage of the covenant, the spiritual men, the ancestors of a chosen nation, Israel, and through them, of all humanity that would be redeemed. They were not the first physiological beings on earth, the only hominids to walk the planet. They were indeed the first men of the covenant, the starting point of a divine story, not the starting point of human life per se. This perspective resonates shockingly with the ancient questions about Cain's wife. Who was she? One of the daughters of men already existing, a descendant of the generic humanity created in Genesis 1, and the people Cain feared in Nod. They were the other human beings already inhabiting the earth, beyond Adam and Eve's immediate family. The idea that Eden was not the only inhabited place, and that God created other forms of humanoid life in other places, and that the story of Adam is our story, the story of our spiritual lineage, not the universal story of human biology, becomes not only plausible but inevitable when diving into the original language. How does this new perspective fit with the rest of the Bible? Surprisingly, and even liberatingly, Adam's original sin is not negated. It remains the original sin of the covenant lineage, the point from which spiritual corruption spread to those under that covenant. The coming of Jesus Christ remains essential, as he is the new Adam, the redeemer of the covenant lineage, and by extension, the redeemer of all humanity that can connect to that covenant through him. Jesus' sacrifice is not a patch for a global biological error, but the restoration of a spiritual relationship broken in Eden by those chosen to be the bearers of a specific light. Imagine for a moment the classic image of Adam and Eve in Eden. Now imagine that image splitting in half, like an ancient mirror, revealing a much vaster world behind it. That is the truth that the Hebrew language of Genesis offers us. The crack does not destroy the image, but expands it, revealing something prior, something greater, something that the simplified doctrine chose to hide. Adam and Eve are our spiritual parents, yes, but not the only inhabitants of the earth. The answer is as old as power itself, control of the narrative. The simplicity of the story of Adam and Eve as the only and first humans was infinitely easier to teach, internalize, and, crucially, control. A linear, unquestionable narrative about the origin of humanity with a single point of failure, original sin, and a single path to redemption through the church, solidified religious authority. If the origin of humanity were complex, if there were other humans before Adam, it would create a profusion of questions that the church at the time had no interest in answering, or, more importantly, no interest in people asking. The fear of disbelief also played a gigantic role. Complexity could easily lead to doubts about the Bible's authority as the literal word of God, or worse, about the church's authority as its sole interpreter. Imagine the theological chaos that would ensue if people began questioning who these other humans were, what their fate was, whether they also needed salvation. The doctrine of original sin, central to the need for Christ and thus to the church's role, would be shaken. Keeping the story simple and monolithic was the safest strategy for hegemony. In essence, it was about power and dogma. The revelation of a pre-Adamic humanity would shake the foundations of millennia of teachings. It would challenge councils, doctrines, and the very infallibility of interpretations that became dogmas. Admitting that Adam was not the first would require a massive re-evaluation of texts, theologies, and the church's role. It is far easier and politically convenient to maintain the simpler, safer version of the story. The truth is often the first victim when power is at stake. They preferred to hide it to maintain control rather than reveal it and risk the foundation of their authority. So what does this truth mean for you? How does this new perspective expand or challenge your understanding of God and the origin of humanity? First, it offers a new vision of creation that is, paradoxically, far grander and more complex. God is not a creator limited to a single event in Eden. He is a creator who operates on multiple levels, at different times, and with different purposes. The creation of Adam, generic humanity, in Genesis 1 and the formation of Adam, the individual man of the covenant, in Genesis 2 are not contradictions, but revelations of a far richer divine tapestry. This does not diminish God, but exalts him, showing his mastery over time, biology, and spiritual purpose. Your faith does not need to be shaken, but expanded. It invites you to a deeper understanding of the Scriptures, to go beyond the surface and dive into the layers of meaning that have been obscured. It suggests that the Bible is not a textbook of biology or archaeology, but a book of spiritual revelation, communicating in layers and through specific purposes. Adam's original sin still matters, but for those to whom it specifically refers, the covenant lineage that God set apart for himself. And salvation through Christ remains the key, but perhaps not just for a universal biological sin, but for the restoration of a broader and deeper spiritual relationship with the Creator. This truth is a call to discernment. It is an invitation for you not to passively accept what you have been taught, but to seek for yourself, to question respectfully, and to dive into the depths of God's Word. The truth is there, waiting to be rediscovered by those who dare to look beyond the obvious. Do not fear the truth. It does not destroy faith, but deepens it. The Bible holds a secret about the true origin of humanity. Adam may not have been the first. This discovery challenges everything. What will you do with this truth? Leave your comment, share this video they want to take down, and subscribe for more revelations that the church hides.